Normandy, late June, 1944. A German Panzer IV sits hull down behind a hedgerow, engine idling low, commander's hatch cracked open just enough to see. He's watching one field, one opening, one Sherman, nosing forward through the gap his gunner has been tracking for the last 10 minutes. The range is good. The angle is good. Everything about this moment says the American tank is about to die. Then the shot comes from somewhere else entirely. Not from the field he's watching. From the hedge to his right, 90 degrees off where his gun is pointed, where there was nothing, 60 seconds ago. His Panzer IV never gets to fire. This happens to German tank crews across the Normandy hedgerow country over and over, through the back half of June and into July of 1944. Not because the Americans found some secret weapon. Not because the Sherman suddenly got better armor or a bigger gun. The Sherman a German crew destroys in late July is, gun for gun, armor for armor, the same tank that struggled so badly in the first weeks after D-Day. What changed wasn't the machine. It was what was happening around the machine. And German intelligence, writing up after-action reports through the summer, kept circling the same question without landing on the answer. How was a tank they outgun and outarmor finding them from angles they didn't think were possible? Today, we're going to solve that one. Piece by piece, the way the Germans tried to and couldn't. This wasn't an abstract puzzle. It cost the German defense in Normandy real ground, real time, and real units it could not afford to lose. Take the terrain itself. The bocage, the hedgerow country of Normandy, was, on paper, a defender's dream. Centuries of Norman farmers had piled stone and earth into thick embankments topped with dense trees and brush, turning the landscape into thousands of small walled fields. A German history of the fighting later admitted what should have been obvious from the start. The structure of the hedges made maneuver extremely difficult for anyone who didn't already know the ground intimately, and direct infantry support became hard to organize because visibility dropped to almost nothing past the next hedge line. The German 7th Army built its defense around exactly that terrain. Rather than holding one continuous front line, German commanders kept their forward positions thin, scattering machine gun teams and anti-tank guns through the hedgerows, and held the bulk of their strength in reserve, ready to counterattack the flanks and rear of whatever American unit broke through. It was a sound plan against an enemy who attacked in straight lines. The problem was the cost of getting that plan wrong started compounding almost immediately. At Hill 192, in front of St. Lo, German positions held for weeks against attacks that came one field at a time, frontally, exactly the way the defense expected. Up to 75% of American casualties in the hedgerow fighting came from German mortar fire, called in the moment an attack stalled in the open. For most of June, the bocage was earning its reputation as some of the best defensive terrain in Europe. Then, in the back half of the campaign, something stopped working for the German side specifically. American attacks that should have stalled in front of the next hedge, the way every previous attack had, started arriving from two directions inside the same field, sometimes three. Counterattack reserves that should have been hitting an exposed American flank found there wasn't one to hit. Whole strong points that had held for a week were gone in an afternoon. By the time Operation Cobra broke the front open at the end of July, the German 7th Army wasn't just losing ground. It was losing the specific kind of fighting it had built its entire defense around winning. So what did German commanders think was happening? Their first working theory was simple: American material superiority. More tanks, more shells, more replacement vehicles than Germany could ever match. And on paper, this made sense. American industrial output dwarfed Germany's, and everyone on the German side of the line knew it. Except for one problem. The Sherman's individual performance against German armor hadn't improved. A Panzer IV's main gun, let alone a Panther's, could still punch through a Sherman's armor at ranges where the Sherman's 75mm gun struggled to return the favor. If this were purely a numbers game, German anti-tank crews should have kept trading favorably, tank for tank, the way they had in early June. They weren't anymore, not in the same fields, against the same terrain, where the math should have stayed constant. So a second theory took over. Maybe the Americans had simply gotten more reckless, throwing tanks forward faster, accepting losses, overwhelming defenders through sheer volume of attempts rather than skill. This explanation had a kind of grim plausibility, too. American tank losses in Normandy were genuinely brutal. Some armored units would suffer loss rates that, totaled across the whole campaign, ran into the hundreds of % of their starting strength, tanks destroyed and replaced and destroyed again. But reckless attacks don't get more accurate over time. They get less accurate, as inexperienced replacement crews cycle in faster than veterans can train them. What German observers were actually reporting was the opposite. The American tanks finding them from unexpected angles weren't getting sloppier. They were getting more precise, more coordinated, more clearly the product of some kind of system, and a purely reckless, throw more tanks at it approach doesn't produce that pattern. A third theory floated through German staff discussions, that Allied air power was simply scouting every position in advance, feeding ground troops a complete picture of German defenses before the tanks ever moved. Air superiority was real, and it mattered enormously elsewhere in the campaign. But it doesn't explain ground-level tactical surprise inside a single hedgerow field, where aircraft overhead can't see through a roof of trees any better than the tank commander on the ground can. The flanking shots weren't coming from intelligence gathered an hour earlier and relayed down a chain of command. They were happening in real time, inside contact, in places aerial reconnaissance simply couldn't resolve. None of these theories were stupid. Each one explained part of what German units were experiencing. None of them explained the actual mechanism, because the real answer wasn't about more tanks, more recklessness, or more intelligence. It was about how the tanks that were already there had started working together. The first real piece of the explanation starts with a problem nobody on the American side had solved before D-Day. Tanks and infantry, in close terrain, couldn't talk to each other. This sounds almost too basic to matter, but it very nearly broke the entire campaign in its first weeks. American tank radios and American infantry radios didn't share the same frequencies, let alone the same equipment. A tank commander, sealed inside his vehicle with a hatch closed under fire, had no reliable way to hear a rifleman shouting from 10 feet away that there was a German anti-tank team in the hedge to his left. The official record of the Army's own after-action review from this period is blunt about it. Initial efforts to combine American infantry, tanks, and artillery in the same attack were, in its own words, uncoordinated. The fix that emerged wasn't a new piece of technology dropped in from a factory back home. It was something closer to a field expedient, a literal telephone handset, wired into the tank's own intercom system, mounted on a bracket on the outside of the hull, where an infantryman could grab it, press it to his ear, and talk directly to the men inside without anyone needing to leave cover. Alongside it, units improvised with pyrotechnic signals and prearranged hand gestures, anything that let a rifleman tell a tank commander what he could see and the tank couldn't. Here's why this mattered specifically in the bocage. In open country, a tank commander standing in his hatch could often see the threat himself. In hedgerow country, with hatches closed against German mortar fire and visibility from inside a tank dropping to almost nothing past the nearest hedge, the tank had effectively gone blind. The infantry walking beside it hadn't. That external phone line was the first thing that let American tanks see through someone else's eyes in real time, in contact, instead of relying on a plan drawn up before the attack started. There's a specific, documented case of what this started producing once it matured. Major General Charles Gerhardt, commanding the 29th Infantry Division, filed a report on an attack by the 2nd Battalion of the 115th Infantry, working alongside Company A of the 747th Medium Tank Battalion, against the town of Saint-André-de-l'Épine in early August. Using the combined infantry tank method the division had worked out and circulated as a standard procedure, the attacking force advanced 3,000 yards, executed a 90-degree change of direction partway through the attack, and didn't lose a single tank doing it. The infantry, moving ahead of the armor at each hedgerow, cleared out German bazooka and Panzerfaust teams before those teams ever got a clean shot at the tanks behind them. That's clue 1. A direct, real-time channel between the soldier who could see and the tank that could shoot. But that alone doesn't explain everything. A telephone line tells a tank where a threat is. It doesn't get the tank physically into position to hit that threat from an angle the defender isn't braced for. For that, something else had to change too. The second piece is about how the tanks themselves moved, and it's more surprising than the first because it runs against what feels like common sense. You'd think, in dangerous terrain, that tanks would want to bunch together. Strength in numbers, mutual support, all the obvious instincts. What American units actually worked out, over weeks of costly trial and error, was closer to the opposite. The same Gerhardt report records the lesson explicitly. Tanks should operate in pairs, but not side by side. In column. One field separating them. The reasoning was almost mechanical. If one tank ran out of fuel or ammunition, or got disabled, the second tank could take over without both vehicles being caught in the same kill zone at the same moment. In practice, this turned into something close to leapfrogging. One tank would push forward to cover the next hedgerow while its partner held back, watching the ground the first tank had just crossed. Then the roles would reverse. The advancing tank was never advancing alone and never advancing blind. There was always a second set of eyes and a second gun watching an angle the lead tank physically could not watch for itself, because no single vehicle behind a hedgerow has a clear line of sight in more than one direction at once. This is where it starts compounding with the telephone link from clue 1. A German crew watching one field, one approach, one obvious lane of advance, was making a completely reasonable bet. That's what tank combat had trained them to expect, a single visible threat to track and engage. What they were actually facing was a tank that had already been told, by an infantryman they couldn't see, where the danger was, paired with a second tank already in position to exploit exactly the angle the German gun wasn't covering. The shot that seemed to come from nowhere in Section 1 wasn't nowhere. It was a position that had been deliberately, methodically prepared in the minutes before the German crew ever knew an attack was underway. Together, these two things, the infantry-tank phone link and the paired, leapfrogging movement, explain a lot of what German after-action reports were struggling to articulate. But there's still one piece missing. It's the piece German observers came closest to noticing, because it was the most physically obvious change on the battlefield. And they still got it wrong, because they read it as a piece of equipment instead of a tactic. The third piece is the hedgerow itself, or rather, what American engineers and tank crews started doing to it. Early in the campaign, a Sherman trying to cross a hedgerow had exactly two bad options. It could try to drive straight up and over the earthen embankment, which exposed the tank's thin belly armor, its weakest point, directly to whatever German anti-tank gun happened to be covering that approach. Or it could stay on the few existing roads and farm tracks, which the German defense had identified immediately and turned into the most heavily mined, most heavily covered ground on the entire battlefield. The 747th Tank Battalion, attached to the 29th Infantry Division, found a third option almost by accident. Lacking the specialized bulldozer tanks that could simply push through, someone in the battalion suggested using demolition charges instead, placing explosives directly into the base of a hedgerow to blow a clean gap through it. After some experimentation, two 24-pound charges set at the right spacing could open a hole wide enough for a tank to pass through without ever exposing its belly on the climb. Engineers refined the technique through the rest of June and into July, eventually settling on paired explosive charges as the standard method. This sounds, at first, like a purely engineering fix, a better way to get from one field to the next. But combined with the first two pieces, it became something much more dangerous to the German defense. A hedgerow gap didn't have to be where the Germans expected an attack to come through, because it could be blown anywhere along the hedge line the infantry tank team chose. The defender's whole strongpoint concept depended on knowing which gaps and gates a tank could realistically use. Once American engineers could manufacture a new gap on demand, in a spot of their own choosing, that assumption stopped holding. So when you put all three together, a real-time channel telling tanks where the threat actually was, tanks moving in mutually covering pairs instead of single exposed vehicles, and engineers able to open a new line of approach exactly where the defense wasn't braced for one, you get the full picture. A German crew positioned to cover the obvious gap in a hedgerow had no way to know a second gap had been blown 90 degrees to their flank 10 minutes earlier, that infantry had already cleared the anti-tank team that would normally have covered it, and that a second Sherman was already sitting in the new gap with a clean shot at the German tank's flank. And here's exactly why it could never have been solved from where the German crews stood. Each piece, the phone line, the paired movement, the engineer charges, looked, from the German side of the hedge, like a separate and fairly minor American adaptation. None of them, on their own, explained the pattern. The Germans were trying to solve a systems problem by examining its parts one at a time, and a system built from three reinforcing pieces doesn't reveal itself that way. You have to see all three pieces working together, in the same attack, in real time, to understand why a tank engagement that should have favored the defender kept ending with the German crew never getting to fire. What this mystery actually reveals isn't really about the Sherman, or even about tanks specifically. It's about what happens when an army treats a tactical problem as something to be solved through iteration under fire, rather than something to be solved once, in a manual, before the shooting starts. None of the three pieces, the external phone, the paired leapfrog movement, the demolition charge gaps, existed in American doctrine before D-Day. They were worked out in the bocage itself, often at the battalion and company level, sometimes literally invented by a sergeant trying to solve the specific problem in front of him that week. The Army's own post-war study of this fighting put it plainly. The side that wins is usually the side that learns fastest from its own mistakes and adapts before the enemy can adjust to the adaptation. German doctrine, for what it's worth, wasn't ignorant of combined arms tactics. German armored warfare had been built on exactly that principle since the start of the war. What broke down in Normandy wasn't a doctrinal blind spot. It was that German units, bled down by accumulating losses and increasingly thin on experienced crews and intact formations, were trying to hold a flexible defense with forces that had less and less flexibility left to give. The Americans, meanwhile, had the time, the replacement strength, and the institutional patience to let three separate small fixes mature into one integrated system. That gap, not a gap in raw tank quality, but a gap in which side could afford to keep learning, is most of what decided the bocage. Here's what I still find genuinely interesting about this, and it's not really a tank question at all. The phone on the hull, the paired leapfrog, the engineer charge, none of them needed a single new piece of equipment shipped from a factory. They needed time, trial, error, and units willing to keep adjusting a method that was visibly costing them tanks and men in the meantime. What I keep wondering is how much of that adaptation got written down anywhere official, versus how much of it just traveled battalion to battalion the way word travels among people who've been shot at together, and how much of it, frankly, got lost the moment the war ended and nobody needed to remember it anymore. If you've got a take on that, I'd actually like to hear it in the comments.